All right, let's talk about something near and dear to all of our hearts, the internet. The internet. So, we've all heard the hype that the internet is going to free the world, free our minds, free everything, free governments, free the people. But at this point, that hype is kind of over. We now all talk about misinformation and disinformation and what to do about it. So, that's what we're going to talk about. It's not going to be what you think. It's not going to be about the domestic, sort of American, Western battles over free speech, but something a bit broader. But let's start with that. So, in the West, we're all talking about basically what you can say online and what you can't. What are the rules for it? What aren't? Who controls what is or is not said? That is the battle lines of a pretty major conflict going on right now. So, there's the internet stuff, there's the major tech platforms, all of that. What can you say? What can't you? What foreign interference is going on in the country? What isn't? And behind all this is sort of a deeper question of what can you say? And does controlling what people say, does that limit what they think? Does that limit the interactions that people have, the thoughts they have, the communications they have? And does that over time limit something important about society, about whether American society or any society? Is there something about this freedom of speech, freedom of communication that is essential to an open society, a democracy, what have you? So we've all heard that the American Constitution does think, the Second Amendment, not the Second Amendment, the First Amendment is about freedom of speech. So it's obviously very highly regarded by the early American founders. But we obviously live in a very different world. So we're going to talk about something a little different. We're going to talk about the international perspective on this, and more deeply, not controlling any specific thing that people say as much as just controlling speech in general. And that is important. It's important to keep in mind that this issue in the US of freedom of speech, to say what you want or not, to balance the harm of what someone says versus the need for free airing of all opinions, that is a microcosm of the broader, deeper problem of, are you allowed to speak at all? So this is very clear in, all over the world, but right now in Cuba. Right now in Cuba, there's protests going on over all sorts of problems in the country due to COVID, lack of tourism, and basically the collapse of that country's economy. Not that it was really functioning that well in the first place, but this is the end of a generation in Cuba. So I'll just briefly talk about this. It's the end of a generation in Cuba. The original Castro brothers, they're now, the second one is out, Raul is out, and now they're trying to become more of a general bureaucratic socialist sort of state, but it's kind of a tough transition to make, moving from a ideologically driven communist utopia seeking state to a more socialist, generally we want to stay in power sort of government. It can be very hard, especially when things haven't been going too well, like in Cuba. But these protests broke out, and almost the very first thing the Cuban government did was shut down the internet. And this is so common, it's become, you don't even think about it anymore. It's so common. I mean, just this year, Armenia, Uganda, Iran, Chad, Senegal, the Republic of Congo, it just goes on and on. Last year, they shut off the internet in Ethiopia and Belarus. Obviously, there's been problems in the Ukraine ever since the Russian invasion. It just goes on and on and on. The internet just gets cut almost immediately when there are protests. And that's important, and it really takes us back to the Arab Spring. So in the early 2010s, there's a bunch of anti-government protests all across the Middle East, and that's where this started. All sorts of pundits in the West, almost entirely in the West, they all started to talk about how the internet was going to free people. Social media was a new deinstitutionalized, sort of decentralized medium for peer-to-peer exchanges that were going to just transform politics around the world and lead to a flourishing of freedom in the Middle East and everywhere else. Well, clearly that didn't happen. The Middle East remains a mess, and it's not going to change anytime soon. But the Arab Spring set up a new battle between these new social and peer-to-peer technologies, communication technologies, and governments around the world. It's it's almost ridiculous how far the vision moved away from the Arab Spring. Obviously, there is no global transformation on the way to transform governments, transform communications, transform everything that people are doing in a way that is going to be accepted. So governments, the thing they took from the Arab Spring was basically to just nip any protest in the bud by just shutting off the internet. And in general, by trying to control the internet like we see in China, where things are truly scary and frightening how much control the government has. But most countries don't have anything like China's capacity to do that. So they do much more minor things. And honestly, the most simple thing you can do is just to shut off the internet entirely. But obviously, if you want to be a modern economy, that's a really tough thing to do. So we're already starting to see this balance, this sort of tension between, okay, we want to control what people are thinking, what they want to control what they do. We don't want anti-government activity going on. We want that, but we also want a modern economy, right? We want to be wealthy and powerful. Obviously, you don't want to be the government of a weak, decrepit sort of state. You want to be the government or the leader of a giant, amazing, powerful country. This was obviously the decision made by the Chinese government in the late 1970s. So everyone is sort of fighting that. And again, getting back to the U.S. and the Western countries, there's almost a shadow version of the same conflict. So if there's misinformation, disinformation, and all sorts of problems going on in the communications media sphere, well, we don't want any of that. We don't want anything that disturbs the government. We don't want the peaceful transitions of power in the United States disrupted or somehow destroyed by all of these new technologies. But at the same time, we can't exactly just shut it all down, right? It is, again, a microcosm of this much broader issue. And I think people should probably try and take this broader view of, let's look at the deeper, more fundamental challenge of these technologies that we see with countries all over the world. And then maybe look more at the United States, because we can get so wrapped up in our own petty melodramas, which is what our politics has become, that we're not going to get a sense for the context. And if you don't have a sense for the context, well, first of all, it's hard to be the number one kind of country in the world and telling other people what to do when all you have is your own frame of reference. Very difficult thing to try and implement, but that's kind of a separate thing. But the thing to keep in mind is that we still live in that world of the Arab Spring, where the internet did not lead to freedom around the world. It led to increased internet repression around the world. And an important thing to think about, just to transition really quick, is crypto in this context. So we always talk about cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, blockchain, decentralized ledgers, etc., as a response to government fiat money, to government control over money in the currencies in various countries. But crypto is as much a response to government speech controls and to government controls or corporate controls of information. So Bitcoin and crypto is in part a development of something like BitTorrent, which is a decentralized peer-to-peer means of transferring files and information around the world. Hence the name Bitcoin, BitTorrent. It's kind of obvious, but we often forget because it's become such a bigger thing. And Bitcoin is, the BitTorrent is so associated with just random guys who want to watch movies or whatever, that we kind of forget that these are technologies that are built off each other, that BitTorrent is actually very closely associated with basic ways in which the internet itself functions and moves information around the network, et cetera, et cetera. But it is about circumventing access on information and controls. I mean, cryptocurrencies are enormously important for this. There's a reason that, again, the crypto part of all this is so much as cryptography, which is about encrypting all of these communications, right? If these communications, if the money that you sent around the world wasn't secure, if the Bitcoin you had could just be taken or whatever, none of this would work. So the core thing behind it is very, very strong cryptographic encryption and cryptographic math and technologies. It's in the name, right? Crypto is in the name. And it's this control or this security you have of information flows that is a really big animating influence behind the crypto community. So it's a huge part of what energizes everyone. Obviously, yes, we call everything cryptocurrencies, which is probably not what we should be using, but not the right phrase. But the question of not currencies, but of controlling information is more important, because just changing the money system, like how long can you stay animated about getting rid of the US dollar when it's been 10 years and it's 20 years and it's 30 years and it's still here? You know what I mean? It's not going to be the animating influence, but a lot of the energy, where a lot of it is coming from, is just this sense that you can not even, I don't know, replace a currency. Again, obviously that's just Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other things are doing very different stuff, but it's this ability to transform the entire way that money, which is another form of information, moves around, and in the way that communications and everything moves around. That's why so many people are calling this basically the Internet 3.0. You had the basic web in the 90s, the web, you had the mobile web. Then now you have, I don't know, cryptographic web, a bit web, something like that. Something cool like that with a great little logo or slogan or whatever. But this, again, crypto was supercharged by all of these problems in the Middle East, by the Arab Spring, by these government controls on information. So you had 2007, 2008, you had the financial crisis, you had all this money flowing into banks, you saw government malfeasance around financial stuff, and then you started to see around the world, you started to see around the world all these problems with financial technologies, not with financial, with information and communications controls, where governments around the world were stifling speech, stifling any communication at all. So China developed a lot of its technologies, primarily actually to surveillance technologies, were primarily developed to control things in Xinjiang and to control them in Tibet and other regions. But it was supercharged, again, by all of these problems around the world. To the Chinese government, the Arab Spring looks a lot like the color revolutions of the 80s and the 90s, when Eastern Europe was just cracking into pieces. Communist Soviet governments were falling like flies. That is, again, a terror, the great fear of the Communist Party. So that emerged. The surveillance controls that we see now, that is insane in China, is developed alongside crypto. It developed alongside this question of, what do you do with information controls? What do you do? How do we deal with this? This is a deep political, economic sort of question. But, one really cool cut on it. So we'll just transition it. We'll talk now just about how you have this development of crypto on one side, decentralized controls, decentralized communications, decentralized networks, and then this need for central control to maintain stability, order, authority in countries, right? And there's this balance, or this battle really, between the two. And Peter Thiel has a great line where he says that crypto is libertarian and AI is communist. Well, we'll just change that to, like, AI is totalitarian or authoritarian. So crypto is libertarian and AI is authoritarian or libertarian. I'm sorry, AI is authoritarian or totalitarian. And there's something really to that, because we see it in the technologies just in the last 10 years. That's kind of the way things developed. There's all sorts of things going on in AI development, but there's on the state level, it is very much the most profound uses of AI are all for surveillance control, sort of social controls, population control maneuvers, really. That's almost certainly what's happening. That's definitely what's happening in China. And a lot of countries around the world are just copying China or even buying their technologies. So it's something we're seeing everywhere. And that's something we have to always sort of remember. The tools to increase surveillance and control of communications are increasing, like, almost by the day, right? So AI is massively ramping up. You're able now to detect people who, like, you could know who I am based on just the audio, the video, my writing style, all sorts of correlated ways. Obviously in China you can do it based on gait analysis and facial analysis and all these different things. But this sense of not just first detecting people, but discovering who they are, everything about them, where they've been, these controls are getting crazy, and it does limit speech. It's a sort of a fear, like, what can I say? What can't I say? And that is what we see. We just see people continually controlling themselves online, not saying certain things, not being who they are. All of this stuff is just almost getting out of control. And that's kind of the reason we see so many anonymous, pseudonymous accounts everywhere. It's just a defense mechanism, basically, for the sort of fear that goes along with being known for who you are, known what you do, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a natural outgrowth of the sort of the world we live in. And the same thing with crypto. I mean, crypto is enabling a lot of these anonymous or pseudonymous sorts of ways of being or ways of communicating, right? Balaji Srinivasan is very big on promoting it, basically a pseudonymous or anonymous world network of people who are trying to move things forward. And just the idea that we need something like that is a testament to the deep, deep, deep fear of what AI is enabling on the communication control sort of front. So in the US, we don't have, our government does things at the NSA and stuff that is like this, but not at all in the way that we see in China. Our versions of AI controls are really more corporate. So different companies can do all sorts of things, particularly the big tech platforms. So a lot of the animus in the United States is against the large tech platforms. It's not as much against the government as it would be if the government was creating social credit scores or something. But that is something that we really need to keep in mind. So when you're talking about communications and free speech and what can and can't be said, we have to realize now that there's also people who are, well, not able to say what they want to say, people who are becoming other people or fake people to say what they want to say. There are all sorts of governments and other groups that are also entering this world. I mean, we live in a world where you can create all sorts of fake accounts, fake people, fake news. You can even just not even fake news. You can create fake video. You could create a fake video of me. Like it could look exactly like this, and I could say a million different things that I haven't actually said, but it looks exactly like me, and people would believe it. If you had like all the videos I've made, and then you just put them through a machine, put them through some machine learning programs, you could probably eventually come up with something that would let you imitate me. And maybe it's not very quick right now. Maybe you need a pretty big data set. Maybe you need a lot of processor time. But 5 years from now, it might be really easy. You could just fake any sort of video I made. So it'd be the exact same background. It'd be the same, look like me. It'd have all my weird quirks, but you could have it do whatever you want. So what does that mean for authenticity or for people's fear of being outed or saying the wrong thing? It brings it to a very new and disturbing sort of place. But we got to remember that there's a deep battle going on between just what you can say and what you can't. And unfortunately, the way it works is that the things that we want to say aren't really nice. So it's kind of interesting, just a quick historical note. Like in the 19th century, Americans were very proud of how like angry, heated, and even violent their politics was. Like you just used to have giant bands of supporters for different candidates would meet in the streets and basically get into fights, get rowdy, and swarm their opponents or their attackers or random people around them. It was pretty insane. It was we could say what we want about the quality of this sort of interaction or whatever, but it was a sign of health to the people at the time. They thought, politics was mean, the political values, political interests are important, and they're very deeply held. So you can't have these weird, placid little debates about things. We live in a very different sort of world. After World War II, we have a journalistic profession, really, brand new profession, that decided it wanted to focus on objectivity. And so we had a world of mainstream outlets that developed that, even though they ignored basically, what's kind of ironic is that on the left, all of the different interest groups that are now a core component of the larger coalition, back in the 1960s or 70s, they had no voice in the mainstream, primarily liberal media of like the main four television or broadcast networks. There was no voice for them. There was no voice for gay people or women or black people or other minorities. Like there was nothing. It was just the kind of waspy Protestant mainstream group. So that's a huge transformation just to think about by itself. But at the same time, this objective sort of world that it created isn't a real representation of politics. And it was interesting that it was often the Republican or conservative side that had the weird, angry, like pugnacious sort of candidates that sort of broke the mold and freaked everybody out. So obviously Richard Nixon being the first and most criminal of them. But that was sort of this break. So it was often in the political sphere, it was the conservative candidates who were sort of trying to break this mold in various ways. There were actually some on the left, but they didn't actually make it to the final round. But that's just such a different world from what we live in today. We also want to have a world that is now so manicured that we can have these political debates without real acrimony. Like, we want it to be sort of safe and pleasant and wholesome for everybody, but it's going to be very hard to do. So in countries, like the countries you see where things are pleasant and wholesome and nice in their political conversations, well, you have one-party states like North Korea where it's all a show and a basically a pageant where it's all fake and it's not really pleasant. It's like a dystopia that you're kind of wandering into. And then there's places like Switzerland or whatever where it's like there's very little internal or external challenges or shifts or changes or anything, and it's a very different world from almost every other country where you have major internal transformations, external threats, and you're much more embedded in a world that is rapidly changing and that you need to evolve alongside. So it's just very different. This world of an objective and nice and kind sort of politics, I mean, that is the politics that excluded everybody back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So it's kind of an odd, ironic thing that's now, in a sense, what people, particularly on the left, are most interested in. And I think I talked about this in another video, this sense that whatever the left is unwilling to often say, so if you're unwilling to point out that, say, perhaps the U.S. is in a conflict with China itself, not in liberal things around the world, liberal governments around the world, the right is often going to say, hey, you can't point them out. I'm going to point out the enemy. I'm going to point out the person we need to actually focus on. I mean, it's good for various reasons for the right, but Trump did that very well with China, where instead of saying, hey, this, that, and the other in the Middle East and pivoting to Asia generally and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And it was more just like directly confrontational in your face against China. And there's that element that a lot of people really like, particularly on the right, they want direct confrontation sort of in that way. So every time the left, particularly the American left, says, hey, we're in a broader, more deeper, more meaningful sort of conflict, it's about values, blah, 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 the right often just says, no, it's about this specific country, this specific thing. And often that's kind of false. It's not really that simple. It's not just the US and China competing, or like in a conflict. It's much deeper, and it's much actually more along with the left. It's like much more of a deeper question about what the United States is or isn't. But this whole thing of pointing out who does what, who doesn't, this creates conflict. This creates this need to actually hash things out. The right and the left don't agree. They don't think the same things. They don't believe the same things. They don't want the same things in a lot of ways. So you actually have to air these issues. And I mean, at this point in the video, we'll just end with some like broad questions to think about as we're navigating this world of increasingly intense battles on the internet and then about the internet, not just in the United States, but also around the world. So what exactly is going to be the answer to this? Well, there are no easy answers. First thing is that there is also no regulatory environment for any of this. There's all the communications laws that we have. I mean, the last ones are probably the late 90s, maybe 2000. These are not set up for this world that we live in. Things are too rapid. There's too many channels of information, and it's very hard to manage any of this stuff. Personally, I prefer more communication to less communication. I don't think stifling speech is really a good idea. I think it often also stifles thought, and we need more thought rather than less thought. The problem is, what are people thinking, right? The challenge is that we want people to think, oh, great, we allowed free speech. Now people had created grand inventions or new ideas or scientific revolutions. Often you don't get that. Often you just get weird personal dramas, minor melodramatic outbursts, and all this kind of stuff. Unfortunately, that just goes with the territory. So a lot of these questions about what to say or like what you're allowed to say is really like, what are we encouraging? What does society encourage people to say? What are we sort of pushed to, not really society, but just by like the media and the sort of media landscape that we live in? Like, what are we pushed to focus on? What are the things that come up in all of our feeds on our various image and text consumption devices and apps? Like, that's all we do is just consume images, media, whatever. What are we actually looking at? What are we obsessed with? Like, a lot of the weird, quite apish sort of things that we like, where it's just like food and other human bodies and beautiful places and blah, blah, blah. A lot of it's just going to be that. But we really need, again, more communication and not less. There's no answer, especially in a world where everyone is so atomized and just isolated you can't have less communication. Less communication leads to all sorts of weird, bizarre things. And honestly, I think it leads to a less dynamic and inventive and insightful and not progressive as in moving into the future rather than just sort of staring at yourself and staying in a sort of rigid, slowly dying present. That's a real thing we need to keep in mind. And the questions that about how do you deal with bots, how do you deal with a world of deepfakes where you can just manufacture images, manufacture videos, manufacture audio? How do you deal with that? How do you deal with echo chambers where people are supposed to be exposed to all these new channels of information, but really they just have like 4 or 5? Like people actually can't process all of this stuff that's being created. So it actually is a very, very bizarrely, paradoxically limited world in the same way. Like most people have a couple things they watch or listen to, and they're not actively exposing themselves to all sorts of different things. They want the stability of someone, a personality, a person they believe in or trust or think is honest or authentic or whatever it is, to actually give them perspectives on things. We don't want absolute undiluted facts. I don't think you can find them, but also people don't want them. They don't consume them. On broadcast TV, on cable TV, it is really just personalities that people are paying for. And it's the same thing on radio. And it's the same thing on the internet. And it's even the same thing in business and media and the news. Like the big stories are the Elon Musks, the Jeff Bezoses, all these big personalities. That's what people want to see. And you're not gonna be able to get away from it. And these personalities have crazy powers. Like Donald Trump ran on a force of personality and a charisma that we kind of hadn't seen, and that really took advantage of all of the obsessive focus that this media system we've created can empower and enable for someone who's in the right position. So all of that is here. When we're looking at countries like Cuba that are shutting down their internet, or Senegal, or wherever it happens to be, we've got to remember that this is a deeper question. I mean, this is the deeper question that is nestled within our problems with free speech. And in the United States, you can't really control speech. You're not gonna be able to shut down communication. So that channel is sort of out, right? You can't, that's not an answer we can follow. That's not a sort of path we can take. There's too many ways that it's just illegal and unconstitutional. But all the other weird things we're doing are sort of the world you have to live in when you can't just shut down the internet. And again, China is a really good example of another side of this sort of spectrum, where China is like, yes, we can shut down the internet, but they're so conscious of how much they need this dynamism, this interaction of ideas, this sense of possibility and the ability to communicate and create different things to power their economy, that they know they don't want 1972 to come back. You can't control everything. You have to do it in a very subtle way. If you want to control everything, you have to be way more subtle than even things like 1984 or other dystopian novels thought about. It is more Minority Report and more of a deeply, a spider web of different controls and subtle mechanisms to influence behavior. It is very much a transform the world with little micro decisions, influence every little micro decision around the world and around your country, really, to get the sort of outcomes that the state desires, that promotes stability primarily. But can they balance stability in a dynamic economy, in a dynamic social world? Probably not. Just probably not. And what does a country like China do when you have to balance between stability and dynamism? Well, you always choose stability, because dynamism can also lead to chaos. And that's what people fear in the United States as well. We fear that if you let too many things just run wild, then you won't be able to control anything. Every election will be a complete frenzy. It might be disputed, it might be this, it might be that, but we need the context. We need the context of what the rest of the world is dealing with and what sort of way it's dealing with. We need a sense of what a country like China is doing, because we're not going to be China. But China is going to be an example of a way to deal with things for a very long time, probably. And it's going to change. Like, no one's thinking, oh, we need to copy China or whatever, but people are, particularly on the left, very fascinated by the things it's able to do and accomplish. And we need to keep that in mind. You can't just say, hey, that's a terrible totalitarian dictatorship and it's awful and terrible. Maybe that's true. But what do you do with the world we live in? Because it's providing certain answers that countries around the world are actually copying. There's people like, I believe it's Guatemala, just bought a lot of Chinese surveillance technologies and is paying them to set it up in their country. So you need a certain vision for the world, right? I actually don't believe in a lot of the crazy sort of American be a beacon for the world in certain ways. Like, you can't transform the entire world. Most countries are never, ever going to look like the United States, but you can be a good example. Maybe you don't push a whole system on people. Maybe you just end up out of Iraq and out of Afghanistan 2 decades later and nothing has changed and you've just wasted all your time. You need a sense of the reality, of the underlying reality in different countries and what's actually possible. And that's very hard to find. Can't find it in the media, can't find it in journalism. You can't get a sense for what these countries are. You need different frameworks. But the US government has, if it wanted to, it could have that information. But we really do need a sense for, like, well, how are we going to deal with these issues? So I hope this video was interesting. Trying to put this question of free speech in a broader context of internet controls and the sense of a battle between decentralized means that people communicate, me to everyone who's listening, or any writer to the audience that's reading his work or her work. Those sorts of communications are sort of in a battle with centralized control. And these governments are worried about, well, they're worried about controlling the population, staying in power, but there is a deep conflict here because there is a hierarchical authority principle in a government. It's right there. Like, politics is about power in a lot of ways. But how do you manage that power in a world that is more complex, more fragmented, more sort of broken and refracted in multiple ways? That's a question that a lot of governments are dealing with, but most governments aren't really dealing with it. They're really just shutting down the internet, like I was sort of saying. They're imagining that they can simplify this question way more than is really possible. So I hope this video gave a sense for the way in which this question can't be really simplified to what we've heard about it, and that we really can't simplify even this discussion about free speech to the way it's talked about sort of in the day-to-day media and mainstream platforms. So hope that was interesting, and we're definitely going to talk again about some of the deeper questions about how China is dealing with data and information and privacy in a way that is actually, in this case, farther ahead than the United States. But again, it's one where the state is driving things, and maybe that's just something Americans and other Western countries just can't get